everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our podcast, No Stupid Questions. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences, or CNIS, at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Bowen, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama. And we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA. So today you are really going to enjoy our conversation with our next guest, who spends a lot of time studying the way the media covers things like the environment, science, and even things like fracking. I've heard that, but I don't even know really what that is.
Exactly.
And I don't know about you or our listeners, but when I hear science, I get a little panicked because I know almost nothing about it. I work in a college of communication, but we all often find ourselves in the middle of environmental events like hurricanes or tornadoes, and sometimes we find ourselves in the middle of pretty significant environmental disasters like the Deepwater Horizon disaster that's now 10 years ago. But this type of information that's communicated and the way that this information is communicated is going to be different based on a lot of factors. So, for example, how do residents in rural areas learn about a tornado that might be heading their way? Is that a stupid question?
That is not a stupid question. And our next guest has all the information and insight into the world of environmental and science communication, which makes us very excited about today's conversation with Dr. Matt Van Dyke, an assistant professor in advertising at the University of Alabama. He applies strategic communication to crisis events and has studied everything from water to weather and fracking. And as Annalisa said, I didn't know what that was until we talked to him either. But we learned a lot in this conversation. We think that you will too. We had a great conversation with Dr. Matt Van Dyke about his research and insight into how science and communication are actually quite complementary, and this world of science communication and everything that can be done in research. So we want to give a very warm welcome to Matt.
Thank you for having me.
We are thrilled to have you. So I have to ask this very first fun question, because I know we're both in the same boat here. How are you and your dog holding up in the middle of this global pandemic and working from home?
The question is how will the dog hold up whenever we don't have to work from home anymore? The dog is holding up very well. We actually have to leave occasionally to walk around the block or something like that, but he is now getting used to being my research assistant, teaching assistant, and just all around, stand for my laptop. He is loving this, and I am too. But yeah.
So mine's been looking at me like, when we first negotiated this contract, there was nothing about you staying at home. I really need my me time. You got to figure out something to do.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that.
So first, can you give us an elevator pitch on your research?
Yes, I can. So the way I like to describe it is I've really studied the processes, problems, and risks and effects associated with communication about the environment, science, and risk. And so there are a few ways that I do this. It's all empirical work, but I use both quantitative and qualitative research methods to essentially look at how organizations communicate about those topics, and then different communication strategies that we might use through messaging and so forth, the consequences of those or the effects of those. Oftentimes looking at the interaction of different audiences' predispositions and perceptions in concert with how they perceive or react to different communication strategies.
So if you had to come up with a headline for one of your more interesting study findings, what would that headline be?
It would probably be too long because I'm a researcher. But
you don't write headlines.
Right, exactly. I was asked this on an interview one time, and I started fumbling through trying to write a headline, and they were like, just talk about your research. But I would say the top headline would probably be, in the case of environmental risk, believing is seeing would be a headline. And the subtext to that would be that a lot of times we selectively perceive what we want to perceive. And in my context, particularly in the case of environmental risk, environmental communication.
So can you tell us a little bit more about your study or studies that have led to that particular finding?
Yeah, so this study in particular was a collaboration with a research group out of Texas Tech when I was there, and it was led by Dr. Melanie Sarge, who is now at Indiana University. And this was back in 2014 or 2015. It was really a time when hydraulic fracturing, or you might have heard of fracking, an energy production method, was starting to gain in prevalence or prominence. And so a lot of the public opinion research we saw indicated that not a lot of people in America were familiar with what hydraulic fracturing was. But we saw a lot of news coverage about it. So we thought this would be a cool, case study to figure out, as people become aware of what hydraulic fracturing is, what implications will message framing have. So we essentially did an online experiment where we took environmental risk frames, visuals of environmental risk frames that you actually found in news coverage, and then the economic benefits frames of hydraulic fracturing. We pre-tested them. We went through quite a few images, but essentially the short of what we found is that depending on people's pre-existing levels of support for hydraulic fracturing or lack of support, that tended to influence how they perceived images of hydraulic fracturing that they saw in the news. So one of the cool findings from a strategic messaging standpoint is that frames had their intended effects if people weren't aware or didn't support hydraulic fracturing at this point. So if you tended to see, if you saw, environmental risk frames of hydraulic fracturing, you tended to perceive it as more of an environmental risk versus if you saw the economic benefits images, you tended to perceive more of the economic benefits. However, if people didn't support hydraulic fracturing, they tended to see what they wanted to see. Regardless of the image that they saw, they tended to see more of the environmental risk associated with the image, and vice versa for those who supported it, seeing more of the economic benefits of the image. So again, it really highlights the occurrence or phenomenon of selective perception, particularly in the context of environmental risk, and people, based on people's pre-existing beliefs or attitudes toward a topic, that's going to influence how they perceive messaging strategies.
So I have to ask, how did you get interested in this whole line of research?
Well, for me, it's largely personal. Where I grew up, I lived in a small coal mining community in the southwestern Virginia mountains. So really close to West Virginia, really close to Kentucky and Tennessee and so forth. And when I was growing up, we talked a lot about coal mining being like the economic lifeblood of the community. As coal mining was successful, so was the local economy, and everyone was happy. And at times when there were economic downturns, it was oftentimes attributed to the coal industry not being successful. So when I went to undergrad, I took an environmental policy class at Virginia Tech, and I was just curious about, what other people had to say about different environmental issues. And what I discovered is that a lot of their points, people who I would have perceived maybe on the other side of, the coal mining issue, for example, they had a lot of valid points. And what I became fascinated with is how multiple people can approach the same environmental issue or any issue from different perspectives. And a lot of times we're talking across each other and not really speaking to each other. And so at the core of it, when you threaten coal mining back home, it's not an environmental issue to them. It's an issue of heritage, of tradition, a way of life, economic security. And for other people outside of the community, it's more about public health and environmental risk, which are valid points. And so that's essentially the impetus and how I got interested in these communication strategies about these types of risks and issues.
So do you have a science degree or
I do not.
It sounds like you do.
I have a communication science degree, 3. But no, I don't have. I just have a really keen interest in how communication applies to science and environmental risk. So I thought I wanted to do science, but when I took biology in undergrad, I found out very quickly that I would beyond the nuts and bolts, I would rather talk about it. The social implications rather than the actual.
And I think that's really interesting, because what it shows is that as communication scholars, we have a lot of application beyond what people might think.
Oh, definitely. I truly believe that we should be embedded, and maybe it's just because, I'm a communication researcher, so I'm biased, but I truly believe that we should be embedded in most research, social research that's going on campus. Everything that everyone's doing has some type of communication or social dimension to it, probably.
Well, can you tell us then, I had mentioned when I introduced you that you had collaborated with people in the Alabama Water Institute. Can you talk about a recent project or something that you're working on now specific to the state?
Yeah, so I'm affiliated with the Alabama Water Institute, and I'm also affiliated with the Center for Complex Hydrosystems Research on campus. And so a couple of projects that we've at least worked toward are typically involving engineers, environmental or civil engineers. One project in particular has we have an interest in trying to figure out how to communicate about risks associated with environmental health in Alabama's Black Belt. And so there are a couple of different projects that we're trying to work on, but essentially the communication piece of that is, how do you talk about environmental risk, particularly in underserved communities or places where the infrastructure isn't there? How do you increase efficacy? How do you, basically just talk about these different types of risk in these communities?
So when you think about environmental risk, are you also talking about things like weather? So are you also looking at things like natural disasters, hurricanes, and tornadoes, and how information about that is communicated kind of real time, especially to these underserved populations that may not have cell phones and great connectivity and things like that?
Yeah, so some of my research has looked at pieces of that, and I would say definitely all of that is applicable to the type of research I do. But there's one project that I've worked on, actually in collaboration with Dr. Corey Armstrong, Department Chair of Journalism and Creative Media, where we've worked with National Weather Service Memphis to basically assess one of the email products that they use to communicate forecasts for flooding. And so we've done focus groups and survey research with their core partners, which include, different first responders, who else? Like people from the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Coast Guard, to basically understand how they interpret that information, and in turn, how they use that information to get risk information out to their stakeholders. So yeah, it's it's related to that, and that's kind of in the context of weather and natural disasters. That's kind of where my work has been so far.
So how do you prepare for these projects where you're the communication expert, but maybe not the expert in weather or in fracking, etc.?
You take a deep breath and sing some Guns N' Roses Patience. It's so the first thing you have to understand, and I think this is true of any discipline, is a lot of times we can be we get really comfortable in our silos, our disciplinary silos, and communication is so ubiquitous that a lot of times we think, regardless of our expertise, that, oh yeah, we know how to do that. I remember as a doctoral student, part of my funding in my last couple of years was to build interdisciplinary connections between the college and researchers on Texas Tech's campus related to water issues. And so I'm sitting in this meeting with civil and environmental engineers, economists, business people, a lot of different folks. And it was a little intimidating, being a doctoral student, to say, okay, let me, contribute to this conversation. And I will never forget, I think it was the economist, when it came my turn to talk, I introduced myself and said, hey, I'm with the College of Media and Communication. And the economist turns and says, oh yeah, you all do brochures, right?
Oh
no.
And so I thought to myself, wow, I can't imagine thinking that there's a whole college dedicated to brochure making. But my response was, we actually do quite a bit of theory-based research. And that point illustrates a lot of the conversations that I have had in my experience in working in interdisciplinary teams. It's not that people don't want to work together. It's a lot of times we have to have patience and be willing to kind of explain what we do or what we can do, or even if, in some cases it might be that someone wants a certain expertise, but I don't have, but they might be interested in collaborating with a communication researcher that does something else, and I can point them to that other researcher. So it really is, it's time consuming to create, and it's really relationship building and listening and learning, but it's also fun and it's very worthwhile, because I think projects that are able to accomplish that have a much broader impact.
So one of the things that you had mentioned earlier was that you do empirical work. Can you break that down for us just a little bit and kind of tell us a little bit more about how you actually conduct your studies, if you're using participants, things like that?
Yep. Yeah. So the methods that I tend to use tend to be both quantitative and qualitative. So I use, on the quantitative side, I tend to do experimental research, survey research, and content analysis work. On the qualitative side, I tend to do interviews and focus groups. So it essentially just depends on, what I'm looking at, and if there's research to support hypothesis, if there's research or evidence to support confirmatory hypotheses, or if my research is more exploratory. And so early on, a lot of what my work has focused on has been, there's not necessarily research to inform clearly what I'm looking at. So a lot of times I'll conduct interview research where I'll talk to, I've done research where I talk to water district officials, or, interviewing other professionals who work in public outreach or public communication capacities to figure out what types of strategies do they engage in. So we can talk about theory all day, but if there's a misalignment with what we're proposing and what people are actually doing, then there's a disconnect that is not necessary. So Um, Similarly, the content analysis work that I've done is essentially looking at how organizations communicate on social media, for example, or how they communicate uh, in the ad space that they use, talking about environmental issues, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really just depends on the project in terms of how I gather content and so forth. I look for a really big list that's valid, and whatever sampling procedure I use, I just make sure that it's valid and robust enough. For the survey and experimental research, a lot of times, if I'm not doing an in-lab study, I'll typically buy a panel through Qualtrics or some other panel provider. And usually this is testing message strategies and asking questions about people's predispositions or perceptions about whatever we're talking about in the study, and seeing how their predispositions again interact with their perceptions of message strategies.
How do you, when you've completed a study, gotten your results, had time to kind of chew over them and figure out discussion points, how do you get that information back to the people that you've worked with to collect the data, like the water district folks or anyone?
Well, first and foremost, I think because the currency in academia is you need to publish in journals, I try to identify journals that have broad readership. So, like a lot of times, if I'm publishing risk research, for example, a lot of times I'll try to go for one of the interdisciplinary risk journals that I know aren't just communication people. I also use a lot of social media and hashtags that are relevant to specific online communities. I'm not sure whether I'm successful or not, but I do. and similarly, I try to keep current, on my website. Again, it's not necessarily. I don't know that I do outreach to specific communities as much as I should, and I really think that's important to do. But I do try to keep all of my social media channels and digital presence up to date with current work, like my Google Scholar profile, ResearchGate, academia.edu, my personal faculty page, and then using social media and those different ways like hashtags and so forth to try to make people aware.
Is there a way that you feel your research contributes to social justice, or are there ways that you are able to be sort of diversity minded in the research that you do?
Yes, and I think it's in part diversity on teams, being able to bring in different perspectives, I think produces a better result in the end. And I also think social justice in the sense that, for instance, the project with, trying to figure out how to better communicate about environmental risk in the Black Belt, for example, I think there are a lot of opportunities to continue that type of work. In a lot of cases, it's not an awareness thing. People in underserved communities are confronted with this stuff at a disproportionate level than a lot of other people. So it's not an awareness thing. So where do the communication barriers exist, or what can be done? For our small slice in communication, what role can communication play in social justice in these contexts? And that's definitely an important question that I find myself asking in my research, and I'm trying to work toward that.
So let's switch gears just a little bit, and how's working from home been? Challenges, bright spots?
The bright spot is I'm kind of forced to write all of the stuff that I have been putting off. When you can't get into the lab and you can't access, certain software and can't collect data from new participants, you're kind of forced to work with what you've been putting off.
So I hear you.
So in that sense, it's been nice to kind of catch up, so to say. At the same time, it's been nice to kind of, I think a lot of times when we're in the hustle and bustle of academia, we don't take enough time to think. Mm-hmm. And so professionally, it's also been nice to have a little more time to think and reflect. And it's in ways it's been refreshing to be able to do that. I know we've got a lot of other stuff going on, and perhaps a lot of emotions and a lot of stuff that we're all dealing with, and even in some cases perhaps more work because we're teaching online and we've still got service obligations and so forth. But it, when there have been some times that I've been able to just sit back and reflect and think, which we don't always get to do when we're running from meeting to meeting or things like that. And I won't talk about Zoom meetings and how exhausting those are, but
they are. It's true.
Well, I think initially, when we transitioned, I was like, well, this is great. I have more chunks of time where I can get my own work done. I've got longer blocks of time to get work done. But then I realized, there's something to be said for walking down the hallway and so definitely it comes with its, pros and cons.
For sure.
So we do want to wrap it up with kind of a fun question that we've been asking everyone. As academics, we have the good fortune of being able to travel to different countries and different cities to present our research at conferences or to be a keynote speaker. What are some of the favorite places you visited for previous conferences, or some of the places that you're looking forward to visiting?
I would say the favorite, well, first off, the place that probably would have been my favorite, which you will know.
I'm going to guess this too.
Australia. But
yep.
That's okay. I would say my favorite couple of places that I've been, San Juan, Puerto Rico was pretty fun.
ICA.
Yeah. And honestly, this is probably not an answer that most people would pick, but I really enjoyed San Francisco just because I'm from the East Coast and I have not spent much time out west at all. And that was, when did I go? Maybe 2015 or something like that. I was intentional about taking a few extra days besides just flying in for the conference and coming back home or whatever. And I was able to spend some time, going down the Pacific Coast Highway and just really enjoying. And that's probably one of my favorite conference experiences, just because I got out of San Francisco and saw a little bit more than just, the city that the conference was in. So I really enjoyed that.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, it's been so great to talk to you today. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and for telling us a little bit more about you and the research that you do.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed talking to you too.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us today in our conversation with Dr. Matt Van Dyke. Who would have guessed a communication researcher would know as much about fracking as he does? I certainly did not. I didn't even know how to spell it. I had to Google that. Next week, we're going to be doing another shift. We're going to be venturing back into the world of sports communication, and we'll be talking with Dr. Keenan Brown, who does all kinds of research about image repair specific to athletes. So if you've ever heard a news story about an athlete making a not very good decision or even a stupid decision, this is what Dr. Brown studies. And if you've liked the podcast so far, please don't hesitate to leave us a rating, even a 5 rating if you don't mind, so that other listeners like you can find us. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you next week.